Welcome to the course Computer Programming for EOR. This is the second lecture that addresses loops and branches. After this lecture, you can apply the syntaxes of for loops, while loops, and branches. You can also explain why these syntaxes are created. And at the end, I hope you will be able to develop complex solutions using divide and conquer strategy. In the previous lecture, you learned how computers execute a program. You also learned about Visual Studio Code and Jupyter Notebook to develop an environments for Python programming. You learned how to execute a program line by line, how the variables created in the RAM, and you also learned how to debug an existing code. You also got familiar with arithmetic operators as well as logical operators. I introduced you to three different data types: integer, string, and float. You also learned how to use string formatting in the print function. We also learned about typecasting, that is changing a variable with a data type to another variable with another data type. You also learned about type error, such as printing string 3 plus integer 3. I'll start this lecture with introducing you to for loops and while loops. First, I need you to pause for a minute and try to answer this exercise. Develop a program that prints from 4 to 48. I can provide two solutions for that. In my first solution, I only use the print function. You can see that I use this function 12 times from by giving arguments from 4 all the way to 48. A second solution would be using operators as well. I used the multiplication operator to calculate 1 times 4 all the way to 12 times 4. Probably you wrote the first line as the answer in your development environments. Then you copied that line and pasted it 11 times. After that, you modified those 11 pasted lines by changing the numbers. I use this exercise to explain why loops are created. Assume that I had asked you to print up to 1024 rather than 48. You had to do 254 paste and modification, and that is quite time consuming. And that's why uh, loops created, because as programmers we are lazy. We want to do a task, you know, and spend as little time as possible. The general rule is that if you see a pattern in several continuous lines in a code, you turn those lines into a loop. But how do we use loops to avoid repetition or the boring task of copy pasting? First, you need to identify what is fixed in a code and what changes after each paste. Then you replace the changing part with a variable, for example, I. After that, you place an indent before that line by pressing the tab key on your keyboard. After that, you need to add the for statement. You need to use the variable I, for example, in the for clause, and in the in clause, you can use the range function and give two arguments. The first argument should be the first number in your line, which is 1 here, and the last number should be the last number that you see in the pattern plus 1. The output of the two codes would be exactly the same. Note that this sign at the bottom means you can find the code in Canvas to run the code line by line. But what does a for loop do? This for loop executes the indented lines 12 times. After each iteration, I is increased by 1. At the first iteration, I is set to 1, the first argument of the range function. Therefore, I changes from 1 to 12, and as a result, the lines 1 to 3 is executed 12 times. Note that if a line is not indented like line 4, that line is executed only one time. It's not going to be part of the for loop. Let me explain what happens to the RAM and the output terminal as a result of executing the previous code line by line. Before executing any lines, there is no variable in the RAM. The first line is highlighted. That means if you press F10, that line will be executed. If you press F10 now, the first line is executed. That means I is created and set to 1, the first argument in the range function. I is checked against the second argument, that is 13. Since I is lower than 13, the content of the loop should be executed. After that, the line, the second line is highlighted. That means it's going to be the line that will be executed if you press F10. After pressing F10, the second line is executed. That means 4 is printed in the output terminal. The cursor for printing goes to the next line as a result of the print function, ready to print another argument. Since it is the end of the loop, the execution highlight gets back to the loop line. The first line is highlighted again. However, RAM is not changed at all. If you press F10 again, Visual Studio Code executes the first line for the second time. That means I is increased to 2 in the RAM. I is checked to be lower than 13. Since it is lower, the content of the loop should be executed again. The second line is highlighted again. If you press F10 again, the second line is executed for the second time. That means 8 is printed, and again the print cursor goes to the next line. As a result of this action, executing the second line, you see that RAM is not changed at all. After executing the first line, the second line, the first line gets the execution highlight. So the first line is highlighted again. This continues until 48 is printed and I contains 12 in the RAM. The first line is highlighted as what to be executed next. Now if you press F10, the first line is executed. That means I has to be increased by 1. I is 12, therefore I will be increased to 13. The condition is checked to see if I is lower than 13. I is 13 is not lower than 13, therefore the content of the loop should not be executed anymore. I is not changed to 13 either. The third line gets the execution highlight. Now try to do this exercise. Write a program that prints from 1 to 12 using a for loop. Then execute that program line by line. Pause here for a minute and create that program. The answer should look like this program. The while loop is very much similar to the for loop. the catch is that you need to explicitly write all the settings. So if we have a for loop that you just saw in the previous slides, you need to turn that into a while using that. You need to use the first argument of the range and set I with that, I equals to 1. Then you have to write the while clause using the second argument of the range function and the I. So I lower than 13. And then you can write whatever is the content of the loop, the print, but at the end of the loop, you need to increase I by 1. So we set I, then we check the condition in a while clause, we put the content of the for loop there, and at the end of the content of the loop, we need to increase I so that it will be checked, the new I will be checked in the while clause. You can also write another, you can map it to another type of while. You can start with setting I here, like what you see here, I equals to 0, and then increase I at the beginning of the loop. Please run the above while loops line by line. Note that if you don't write the while loops carefully, they can create an infinite loop and then the program never ends. So this can happen if you miss to increase the I at the end of the content of the loop, or you write a wrong condition in the while clause. As a result, the program runs to the end of time, but you can easily use run stop debugging to stop the program. In the next video, I explain how you can use divide and conquer strategy to develop a complex program.